in on this Friday. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us. Thank you so much for being with us today for Water in the World as We Know It with our guest, Giulio Boccaletti. My name is Constance McBaron, and I lead communications for EarthLab at the University of Washington. And quickly before we get started, I want to give a hearty thanks to Athena and the Future Rivers program for being our co-sponsor for this event today. So before I introduce you to our speaker, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I live and work, where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. I acknowledge and honor the past, present, and future Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. From wherever you are joining us here today, I encourage you to learn more about the land you are on. And if you are in North America, a good resource to visit is www.native-land.ca. My colleague is putting some of these links in the chat for you. So we know that land acknowledgements are important to say, but they must be followed up by meaningful action. And that is why I'm proud to join you today representing an organization that is committed to centering equity and justice in our work. EarthLab is a visionary institute at the University of Washington that pushes boundaries to develop innovative, just, and equitable solutions to environmental challenges, with a focus on issues at the intersection of climate change and social justice. We do this by connecting across sectors and academic disciplines to inspire and incentivize new partnerships that bridge the UW and the wider community, and by convening cross-cutting critical conversations such as the one we are co-hosting today. So we're really excited for this event today, which will consist of a short presentation by Giulio, followed by an audience Q&A. We actually left a lot of time for Q&A, so we're looking forward to your questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and be sure to vote for your favorite questions. You can use the upvote button. Also, I would like to add that we've enabled auto captioning. So if you would like to turn the captions on or off, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And now to quickly introduce our speaker and get into it. So Giulio Boccaletti is an author, entrepreneur, and an internationally recognized expert on natural resource security. For the last 2 decades, he has worked on strategy, sustainable economic development, and conservation issues across 12 countries. He started his career as a climate scientist at Princeton University and MIT. He was a partner of global consultancy at McKinsey & Company, where he was a leader of its sustainability and resource productivity practice. And he was a chief strategy officer at the Nature Conservancy, which many of you know is one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. He's also the co-founder of Chloris Geospatial, a venture-backed company dedicated to measuring nature's contribution to the global economy. Giulio is a published author, and he has contributed to the development of several documentaries for PBS. His most recent book, Water, a Biography, is a history of the relationship between society and water, and it was listed among the best books of 2021 by The Economist. And that's one of the main reasons why he's here with us today. So now I will hand it off to Giulio. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening. In all honesty, I hope the core of the discussion will be the conversation and the question and answers that we can get into in a little bit. So I've been asked to speak for about 15-20 minutes on the book, and then we'll just open it up to hopefully a conversation. It's a little tricky to do in Zoom. I'm here in London, living through Storm Eunice at the moment, but hopefully we'll manage the conversation across the Atlantic. So what I thought I'd do is I'll share a couple of slides in a second, but let me just start by telling you a little bit why I decided to write this book. You know, I've worked on environmental issues and water issues in particular over the last couple of decades all over the place. I ended up working in a number of developing countries in Ethiopia and Jordan and China and India, South Africa, Mexico, etc. But also in developed countries, the United States, UK, and other places. And one of the observations that I've had in working on water issues in all these countries is that there's a bit of a tendency for conversations about water to become conversations about technical solutions. They're sort of very focused on engineering and on technique, on techne. And so you might end up having a conversation about desalination or alternative supplies. If you are in an arid place, you may end up having a conversation about flood management and levees and dams if you're in a place that suffers floods and so forth and on. But as time went on, as I dealt with decision makers more and more, I sort of came to the realization that engineers and technology providers are really answering questions. And we shouldn't focus so much on the answer they provide, but rather on the question that they're being asked. And those questions are fundamentally political. They are questions about how we should live together in the landscape. Questions about water in particular are fundamentally questions about sovereignty. They're questions about who gets to decide what to do with the landscape. We started this conversation today reminding ourselves of the underlying sovereign title that of the land that University of Washington is on. And that's the sort of issue that really underwrites all of conversation about water. Who gets to decide what we do with our landscape, and who gets to decide what our home looks like? And that's really kind of the heart of the water question. It's not a technological question. It's a political question, which is actually quite a discovery to make as a scientist. I'm a scientist by training, but I sort of came to this realization as I confronted the reality of dealing with water security on the landscape. So that was the kind of first realization. I then came to the conclusion about 5 or 6 years ago that we were living through a very particular time, because we are a strange generation. We've we enjoy, most of us, those of us who live in developed and rich countries, enjoy a remarkably homogeneous water environment. If you live in Seattle, or you live in London, or you live in Los Angeles or Tokyo or Rome, doesn't really matter. Your experience of water is actually remarkably identical, even though all these places have very, very different climatologies. We all don't wade a river for the most part as we go to work in the morning. We don't have to worry about, a river washing through our living room and taking away the piano with it, as Faulkner used to say of the Mississippi. We all turn taps, fixtures on our walls and somehow get water. And this is true almost anywhere you go in rich and developed countries. And so we live in this kind of illusion of security, and it's an illusion that's been built quite carefully over the last 100 or so years. But things are changing. You will have seen, obviously the fires in the west of the United States are an indication that the dryness and the continuing drought in that part of the region is having an impact on the ecosystems there. You will have seen floods, well, certainly in New York, as Storm Ida came through a few months ago, storms in Europe, storms that lead to floods in China and so forth, so on. It seems like the solutions, the infrastructure that we had built and that protected us so well over the course of the 20th century is starting to fail. And indeed, I think that's what's happening. I started life, as I said, as a climate scientist, and the climate system is changing. And as it does, water, which is simply the expression of the climate system on the landscape, the floods, the droughts, the storms, they are the agents of the climate system on the landscape. Well, those are changing too. And as they change, they escape the boundaries of the walls and levees and dams and infrastructure we built to protect ourselves. And so things are changing quite rapidly. And over the last 5 or 6 years, this has become quite obvious, even in very wealthy places and developed countries like the ones that I believe we all live in. And so it was particularly important for me to engage on the question of, well, if new choices are emerging in water, if new questions are being asked about what we should do with the landscape, we have to make sure that people understand that these are not, the answers to the questions cannot just be delegated to engineers or scientists. They are profoundly political questions. Again, they are questions about what should our landscape look like? What should our home look like? Who gets to decide the answers to that question? Those are profoundly political questions. And so I wanted to reveal that story. I wanted to reveal that basic fact that technical conversations are only accessible to a few, but political conversations have to be accessible to everybody. Citizens author their lives through the language of politics. And so it's really important that we all participate in those discussions about what our future on the landscape is and what our future in our relationship with water is. And so that's why I wrote this book, to tell the story. And I chose to write the book. Let me just share my screen as I speak here, so you can see my screen, and I'll go there. There we go. And so I wrote, laser pointer, there we go. I wrote this book really to tell that story, and I chose to write a history of the relationship between water and society, essentially from 10,000 years ago to the present. And I decided that was the way to do it, because I felt that history and the stories of our institutions in particular was a particularly good way and a particularly good angle to choose to give access to as many people as possible to this idea that really the story of water is a political story. Now, tonight, I'm not going to tell you the story of the book, and hopefully some of you will have read it, and maybe we can get into some Q&A later. What I thought I would do in the next 10, 12 minutes is to just give you two snippets, two visual snippets, actually, because this is a Zoom call and it's a presentation, so I figured I would show you something, just to give you a sense of the spirit with which I've engaged in this story of water, in the history of water and society over the ages, in this attempt to reveal the profoundly political nature of that relationship over time. And the first thing I wanted to show you is this. Now, hopefully you can see this. Let me reduce my, I don't know if I can reduce my, well, hopefully you can see the block, even if you see my my face on the screen. So this is a artifact from the British Museum. It's actually held just a couple of miles from where I'm calling you this evening. And it's a fired clay tablet. It's about the size of a paperback book, so it's about 6-7 inches tall, and some people call it Imagomundi. I'll explain that in a second, but it comes from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Nineveh is near Mosul in modern day Iraq, and this is an artifact that's from the 6th or 7th century BCE, but what's on it is probably a copy of something a little earlier, probably from the 9th or 10th century BCE, so almost 3,000 years ago. And there are two things that are interesting about this artifact that speak to the kind of themes that I go into in the book, particularly as I talk about antiquity. The first is on the bottom half of this image. And you can see it here. So this, hopefully you can see my pointer. This bottom part here is Imagomundi. It's the first known map of the world. And what you can see, the features here are all described in cuneiform language, but this vertical couple of lines here, this is the Euphrates River. So this is a map of Mesopotamia, of the Mesopotamian plains, surrounded by the Salt Lake, this circle, which is essentially the sea. This block in the middle here is Babylon. And then out here you have the mountains, the Zagros and Taurus mountains that surround the Mesopotamian plains. And then as you follow the Euphrates down south, you find on the right-hand hand here, you find the Mesopotamian wetlands, vast Mesopotamian marshes, which actually were there until the 1980s when Saddam Hussein drained them. And then on the left here, you have the Shat al-Arab, which is the canal that connects the Gulf of Persia to the Euphrates system. This is the canal that Alexander the Great used to travel through the Euphrates, and it's the same canal that gives access to the Euphrates system today. So these are a few etched lines on this unfired clay and represent the world for Mesopotamian people, and it's centered entirely on water. And this is one of the kind of first points that I make in the book, and I spend quite some time talking about this in the book, the fact that the variability of water for sedentary communities for many, many years, all through the 18th century actually, is the primary challenge to life in the landscape. Water operates on scales that far transcend the individual. Rivers are larger than any individual can manage. Floods overwhelm entire communities, and so by their very nature require a collective response. And so they essentially provide a stimulus for social organization. And that's really, in a way, the story of the early civilizations as they dealt with their water landscape, was the construction of institutions that allowed them to organize together, manage these kinds of rivers. In the book, I talk a fair amount about Sumerian and early dynastic civilizations, for example, as they dealt with this rather complicated river. We can talk about it later. Euphrates and the Tigris in particular is a very difficult river to deal with. So that's the first point. What is at the heart of this? And by the way, this image, which is a 7th, 9th century artifact, as I said, is probably actually contains information that goes all the way back to the beginning of Sumer. So you're talking about probably 4000 BCE, the very, very first kind of state-run civilizations in history, places like Uruk and others. The other thing that's interesting about this tablet is on the top half here. Now, I'm assuming that nobody here, I may stand corrected, but I suspect that nobody here actually does read cuneiform language, and I certainly don't read sight read cuneiform language. But I have read translations of what's on this tablet. And what's interesting about the top side of this tablet is that it makes reference to a number of characters that show up in a very famous epic. In fact, the oldest epic that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, some of you may have read the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh talks of the great King Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, probably lived around 3000 BCE. It's a sort of epic that's written on a number of tablets that come from the same place, from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal. And it's the story of this king as he roams the world with his friend Enkidu, mostly doing damage and getting up to no good. Eventually, Enkidu gets killed by the gods in retaliation for sacrilege. And Gilgamesh, distraught, goes in search of the secret of eternal life. And now there's a story that relates to water in that particular episode of the epic, because Gilgamesh goes out and looks for a patriarch called Utnapishtim, which is mentioned on the back of this tablet. Utnapishtim, the faraway. And Gilgamesh goes and asks him, what's the secret of eternal life? And Utnapishtim tells him a very interesting story. And the story is that at one point in his early life, a god tells Utnapishtim that the world will be flooded, and that he should build a boat, put all of his animals and his family on it, and save himself as the world goes underwater. And so Utnapishtim builds a boat, the flood comes, it covers the world, and Utnapishtim floats for days and days and days and nights and nights and nights across the world. Eventually, he wonders whether land has reappeared, so he sends a dove out in search of land, and the dove eventually comes back with a small branch in its beak. And eventually Utnapishtim understands that means that land must have reemerged, and he lands on the top of Mount Urartu as the floodwaters dissipate and go away, and then life begins again. Now this story, which is the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you will have recognized, is also the story of Noah from the Old Testament. But what's remarkable is that in this little unfired tablet, the story of Utnapishtim probably predates the story of Noah by about 1500 years. The story of Noah is written in Genesis. Genesis is written between the 7th and 6th century BCE. This story probably dates back to 2500 BCE or even earlier. And that's another theme of the book. You know, the relationship with water is a deeply cultural relationship, and it shows up all over the place. In particular, I spent some time on the myth of the flood, which turns out shows up in almost every civilization on the planet. The story of the flood is not just Noah's story or Utnapishtim's story, but we find it in the for example, in the Native American tribes, the Lenape of Manhattan descended from the survivors of the Great Flood, and so did the Navajos. The Unupachacuti flood of the Inca tradition, for example, tells a very similar story, as do many origin myths from China. So this kind of profound and kind of fraught and dialectic relationship between the overwhelming power of water and the early societies is a very common feature across the world. So the book, as it deals with antiquity and as it gets into the Middle Ages, it's really an archaeology of ideas. Just like I did here, I try to find evidence across time of where our relationship with water ends up showing up in myths, in culture, but also in institutions. And in the end, I make a case, which you'll have to read the book to examine in more depth, but I make the case that the principal institutions of modern society, the institutions that surround us, the institutions of democracy, of the legal system that we inherited from the Roman system, and even the republic, which is the dominant form of social organization on the planet today, they're all institutions that are in the DNA of which resides a dialectic relationship between society and the landscape. So let me just show you another little artifact, which I thought would be quite sort of interesting to bring you to the 20th century, and then I'll close and we can sort of get into a discussion about water and society or whatever else you might be interested in. So let me go to the next image. So the next image transports us now to the 20th century. And I find this painting also quite evocative. Now, this is a mural that is currently held at the Smithsonian. It's actually 7 meters long. So this is a very, very large mural by a painter called Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton is famous today because he was briefly the teacher of Jackson Pollock. But in his day, he was a fairly famous regionalist painter. Mostly his heyday was in the 1930s. He painted a number of murals at the New School, for example, or in Illinois, some of them quite controversial. This particular painting was commissioned to him by Hertzfeld's store in Kansas City, and it sat originally over the over in the perfumery section over the elevator bank of the first floor. And it's quite remarkable that he painted this for a commercial outfit because evidently he assumed that the imagery here would speak to the customers of Hertzfeld's store in the middle of the country. And it's called Achelous and Hercules because it refers to an Ovidian myth, the myth of Achelous, the river god who fights Hercules. Now here you can see the Achelous is actually the Missouri River, not the Kansas River, the Missouri River here in the painting, and the Hercules is double here, these two youths, bare-chested youths, who actually represent the Army Corps of Engineers. This is the middle of the 20th century, is the height of the American development of the landscape, a federally underwritten development on the landscape. And in one kind of painting, in one ode to the agrarian world, Thomas Hart Benton sort of captures the fundamental dialectic relationship between the American Republic as represented by the Army Corps of Engineers and the powerful nature of the American landscape represented here as Achelous. You can see in the background back there, the Missouri River. And then a reminder here of the importance of this landscape for the world, this proleptic horn of plenty that you see here with all the goods that came from the landscape, from the American landscape. You have to remember this is 1947. The American Midwest was feeding Europe as it had just come out of the war. Food was flowing eastward towards Europe, and currency was actually flowing back westward towards America. And that was actually the basis for the Bretton Woods settlement. Now, there's a lot to be said about this painting, but what I wanted to point out was that this in a way captures the really profound relationship between the American Republican project and its Western expansion and Western frontier all through the 19th century and early 20th century, the relationship between the American Republican project and its unusual and profound and powerful landscape. Now, it turns out that this image of a powerful state that conquers nature and did so through infrastructure in the West, and infrastructure that you're all very familiar with, ended up becoming the model, the archetype for the whole world. And in fact, right at this time, more or less at this time, as Benton was painting this this picture, Truman was committing the country to his famous 4-point strategy. And the idea was to use the technical experience that the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation had developed in the Western United States to assist developing countries across the world in an attempt at convincing them to stay outside of the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. And so, you know, archetypical institutions of this time, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, which are foundational water institutions, became archetypes for the world. You know, I worked in Jordan. We have the Jordan Valley Authority. In Afghanistan, there's a Helmand Valley Authority. In Ethiopia, there's a Nawash Valley Authority. The Indus was designed initially, the treaty, as a valley authority. Even the Yangtze, the Three Gorges Dam that was eventually built, was based on a project that originally was developed by John Stevenson, the chief of the Army Corps of Engineers, who was inspired by a valley authority, and so forth and on. Even Jean Monnet, the founder of Europe, thought of the European Union as a version of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So the experience of the American Republic on its landscape ended up shaping the way in which we all deal with water. And in fact, that's the reason why I started this talk by telling you, you know, whether you're in London, you're in Seattle, Los Angeles, Tokyo, you all experience water in the same way. Well, that's pretty much a gift that America gave to the world, is one and only one way of dealing with water insecurity. And I'll just close by saying that the reason all of this matters now is that that model that served us so well in many ways, at high cost, but so well for over a century, and that contained the DNA of these long institutions that stretch back in time, well, that model seems to be failing. And that presents profound questions of how we're going to live together in a dangerous and water insecure landscape in the future. And the answer to those questions are not going to be, as I said, technical. They're going to be fundamentally political. And they're going to call into question the very foundations of some of the institutions that we've come to accept as kind of the bedrocks of our modern societies. So anyway, so I'll stop there. Let me just stop sharing this screen. Oops. Let's see if I can stop this. Whoops. Sorry, there we go. And bring it back to you guys and see if there are questions, and maybe start getting into a discussion. Apologies if this was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I figured you guys, because there are so many students, would have questions and would rather have a conversation than listen to me drone on in a almost English accent for 45 minutes. So over to you, Constance.
Thank you, Giulio, and thank you all again for being here today. I do see some questions coming in through the Q&A box. Thank you. Please keep them coming. I will start with the first question we received from Sally Jewell. Thank you, Sally, for being here today. She's on our advisory council here at EarthLab. And so Sally asked you, Giulio, in your historical research, water has been harnessed and has shaped where people live. At this time of climate change, where our water structures may be overwhelmed or empty, how do you see this impacting migration in the coming years?
Yeah, well, that's a really important question, because one of the things that's happened over and over again in the book, I spend time on, you know, everything from the Bronze Age to, you know, the international systems of the 17th century, and, you know, and in all of those stories, you kind of use a geopolitical framing, and you start looking at the balance of powers between different, you know, nations first, and then states in more modern times, and almost invariably, when confronted with a profound change in climate, think, for example, of the Little Ice Age of the 17th century, or, you know, the shifts earlier in, you know, in the time of Diocletian, almost invariably, what happens is that water does provoke a crisis, but it's not a crisis directly forced onto the wealthy and powerful nations of that geopolitical system. What tends to happen is that the most vulnerable in that system are exposed to changes. They get detached from the fundamental pacts of sedentism and start moving. You know, this is true with the sea people in the Bronze Age, which brought down essentially the international system of the Mediterranean. It's true with the Huns, which show up on the shores of Black Sea and pushed the Goths over the border into Rome. And in a way, it's true with the events of the last few years, with migratory routes that have crossed the Sahel and the Sahara and gotten to the shores of North Africa and into Europe. And that's particularly important because states are failing, right? Particularly, for example, if you think of the north of the Horn of Africa right now, the Horn of Africa right now, there are 13 million people that may go hungry in the next few months. We already know that there have been at least 1 million displaced people in Somalia. Eventually, if state capacity is unable to meet the demands of these people, eventually they'll start making their way through to where they think they might be able to survive. It's humanity, right? I mean, that's what we all do. And so the problem of climate change in the face of vulnerable states very quickly becomes a problem of migration. And then a problem of migration becomes a geopolitical problem, as we've seen recently. So, you know, Sally, I think that the issue of climate change and migration is going to, I think, dominate the next 30, 40 years. And it's not, you know, the most dangerous flood that comes from water insecurity is not a flood of water, it's a flood of people. That's what happens over and over in the course of history.
Thank you, Giulio. We have another question. This one is from Dargan Frierson. He is a researcher at UW. He says, hi, Giulio, congrats on your wonderful book. I find that studying history often gives me ideas for new scientific research. I wonder whether the historical research you did for your book helped you to identify any understudied fundamental scientific questions related to water on Earth, or what are the underexplored interdisciplinary water research areas that students of today should consider studying?
Well, so first of all, it's a great pleasure to see Dargan here because we haven't seen each other in 20 years, but we were graduate students in the same place roughly at the same time. So it's wonderful to see his name, if not his face. Well, you know, it's an important question. You know, one of the things that struck me about writing this book comes from a place of practice, right? It was inspired by the kind of issues that I faced in dealing with decision makers over 15 years, McKinsey first, and then to some extent the Nature Conservancy. And one of the things I noticed was, you know, I think in academia, interdisciplinarity is very fashionable, but it's only when you actually confront these practical issues that you realize just how important it is. Because one of the reasons you know, I used the language of history is because when I was, for example, visiting the Three Gorges Dam, the manager of the Three Gorges Dam justified its existence on a historical basis, not on a technical basis, a scientific basis, right? We tell the story of ourselves and our societies through many different languages: history, sociology, anthropology, science. And so one of the things I would say is that it's become very, very clear that this interdisciplinarity is not just interesting, it's important. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, Dargan, is that the sort of recent paleoclimate, which is starting to make its way into history departments now. I mean, I think that, you know, it used to be the purview of paleoclimatologists, but more and more, I think there are interesting programs at Princeton itself, where we both were, but also Harvard and other places, people sort of looking at the last 2,000 to 3,000 years and trying to understand in a somewhat materialist way how changes in climate then affect social systems. It's still, you know, it's still a largely under-theorized and unexplored area of work, but I think it's a fascinating area and one that you know, deserves more and more in attention. And then the third thing, and the last thing I'll say, is maybe this: the place that I think is most deficient in thinking about these problems, and particularly water problems, is mainstream economics. You know, I was struck recently, I was reading a pretty mainstream journal, economic journal of economics and political economy, on the future of capitalism. And I was struck that I think land, the word land, was mentioned twice over 16 articles. That's quite remarkable. Now, there's plenty of people that do land economics, and there's plenty of people that do environmental economics. But the sort of economists that end up advising ministers of finance, the sort of macroeconomists that are trained in marginalist theory, are essentially blind to geospatial issues, to locational issues, with a few exceptions. And so I think that's an area. It's not, it's not a scientific area, Dagan, although economists might think of themselves as scientists, but it is a social science. I'm always reminded of Auden, thou shalt not commit a social science, right? But it's a really interesting area. How do we incorporate these issues that are actually wrestled with quite well in history, sociology, and anthropology in mainstream economics so that they can get channeled to the decision makers and the allocators of capital?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Julian Oldman. He's a UW professor, and he's also part of the Future Rivers program, one of the leaders there. He asks, so there are emerging conversations and examples of using legal personality to protect water systems in law through the granting of legal rights to rivers. What are your thoughts on using environmental personhood as a way to protect river systems and ensure sustainability development in the future?
Yes, there are. In fact, I mean, they've been in New Zealand famously. There's and there's more and more people thinking in this way. I recently, a couple of months ago, I gave a talk at the Stegner Center where this was part of the conversation. So I would break the problem down into two parts. Something I talk about a lot in the book is the constitutional architecture that the state adopts. That's the place where a lot of these tensions ultimately end up. And it's one of the reasons, incidentally, why I spend so much time thinking about Republican institutions, because I happen to think that the Republic is a particularly well-honed contract to manage collective benefit and individual freedom in the landscape. We've sort of forgotten that in America, in Italy, and other places. We think of, we say republics, but we often think as liberal states, but actually those are not the same tradition, not the same thing. And so in many republics, certainly in the American Constitution, there's no mention of the environment, no mention of rivers, no mention of landscape. So many constitutional compacts are sort of blind to environmental issues and the relationship between people and the environment. That's changing. Now, that's not true of, there are some state constitutions in the US where in fact there are provisions. That's changing. There have been a number of, and it's changing, by the way, because of climate change. People are bringing court cases based on essentially tort law, which then gets converted into constitutional issues around the right to health and a healthy environment. Those are individual rights, right? But they are increasingly enshrined in constitutions. In fact, last week, my own country of Italy amended its constitution to include words like biodiversity and ecosystems in its protection of its on its landscape, which is quite remarkable. Italy is the oldest existing constitution to have a provision of the protection of the environment. It was the first in 1948, and so it's amended now to include a much more modern conception of the environment. I think that's going to happen more and more. I think that the easy thing to do is to add words around ecosystems and nature and the likes. I think the harder thing to do, which we'll find, I think, in the next 20, 30 years, is to redefine the boundary between the role of the state and the rights of the individual in managing the landscape when the climate is changing. I'll come to your question of personhood, but I think that this framing is important because I think there are a number of really interesting constitutional questions there. You'll remember, maybe some of you will remember, that when the Tennessee Valley Authority was set up, it was set up in Tennessee. It was supposed to be set up in other 4 places in the United States, in the Columbia River, in the St. Lawrence River, and in the Colorado. But it didn't, because it was essentially killed in the Senate because of accusations of federal overreach. So the problem was that the Tennessee Valley Authority was a public institution that had the power of eminent domain. And so the state could come in and reclaim land and subordinate the individual rights to collective benefit. So the real tension in the management of water in the early days in the United States in the 20th century were the tension between the reach of the state and the individual rights. Today, we're back there. We have a climate system that's creating problems that have materialized as collective problems, right? And require the state to act. And the real tension will be, I suspect, in the boundaries between where does the state power begin and where does it end. And we already seen this. For example, there was a case in the Netherlands not long ago that mandated the state to intervene in the economy to reduce emissions because of the potential damage that would come from flooding from climate change, right? So all of this is in the context of a relationship between individuals and states, between individual rights and the power of the state to protect the res publica. Now you introduce a different problem, which is whether other things other than humans should have personhood and individual rights in the context of constitutional compacts. And to be perfectly frank, I haven't made up my mind on that yet. Something I've been thinking about quite a bit. I'm a humanist by nature and history, and so I struggle with the notions of personhood as somebody who grew up. I grew up in Italy in a sort of heavily sort of Republican, not Republican in the American sense, Republican with a small r framing. And so to me, the question of individual rights and individual civic liberties transcends all others. As a statement of protection of the environment, this is a powerful statement. The fundamental question that I don't know the answer to is whether granting these personhood rights actually does in the end help you deal with fundamental trade-offs when push comes to shove. And I don't know that we've tested those provisions yet enough to know whether they can survive when, for example, Italy, Article 1 of the Italian Constitution gives the right to work, right? That's a fundamental right of the Italian Constitution. What happens when the right to work and to economic development conflicts with the protection of a ecosystem? We still have to find that out. So sorry, it's a very long answer to say that I think it's a really rich, another area where students should spend time, studying and thinking.
Thank you. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that before, so that was new to me personally. Sally has another question in the Q&A, and it's one that I also had as well. So combining questions, do you see any country in the world that is doing a good job of getting ahead of water management at the present time, accounting for anticipated changes to water resources? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Yes, I mean, the couple of challenges. So it's a great question that is a complicated question, because of course the good job is good in context, right? So part of the point that I try to make in the book is that this is indeed a relationship, a dialectic relationship, but judging whether something works well or not can only really be done in the political context in which it is affected. There are individual examples that that are interesting. Famously, the Netherlands has developed a fairly sophisticated way of dealing with water, in part actually inspired by some stuff that happened in the United States in the 50s and 60s. One of the challenges and one of the things I worry most about is that if you were to ask that question of the world, if you took a poll in the world and asked that question across developing countries in India, in Africa, you would probably get the answer that China is doing a good job at managing water. Because the fact of the matter is that China replumbed its landscape in service of economic development. Hydropower was, the principal driver of industrialization for at least first 20, 30 years of its industrialization. Three Gorges Dam is the sort of epitome of that journey. And very recently, Xi Jinping has announced, as of 2017, that China is an ecological civilization. which, when translated into English, the words sound a little weird, but actually it's an interesting commitment to a somewhat ill-defined vision of environmental integration into the future. And I say I'm worried because that's an example of what, by all, from all angles, this is a despotic regime who is celebrated by many as a great environmental champion. And that to me is the heart of the matter. If we separate the problem of politics from the problem of solutions, you end up saying, well, they do a really good job, despite the fact that then you have an authoritarian regime, and an increasingly authoritarian regime. And so I think you can't separate the two. That's why I think it's so important to keep those two questions together. A country that does a good job is a country that balances individual civic freedoms and collective benefit. It's the first measure of success, and therefore is a country that has been able to articulate a water security environment that's acceptable to its population, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same for everybody, right? Different countries might end up with different answers to that question. How much risk should we tolerate? How much investment should we make in water security in order for all of us to live at the rhythm of the industrial productive economy? So you can't really separate whether something is a good answer without knowing whether they've asked a good question. And I would argue that that's kind of the challenge here. So again, sorry, a very long answer, but if you were to ask me, are there interesting technical answers to very specific questions? Yes, of course, there's interesting experiments. I think, you and I, Sally, have lived the world of ecosystem services and investments in nature. And so there are good examples of those, but I sometimes worry that we separate them from the larger political question, which is, do we have a civic compact that allows us all to hold together a vision of what our landscape looks like?
Thank you. I appreciate the nuanced answers. I think obviously if we had a simple answer, we would have done it already. So I think
it would have been a shorter book too.
It was shorter. I think this next question from Sam is a good add-on to that, talking about how governments control small island communities. And so he's calling it Hawaii and wants to know how water management plays a part in these island communities that are often controlled by governments far away.
Well, it's a great question, because I think that the other thing that you learn from looking at the history of water is that the construction of these institutions is happens quite bottom up. There's a vast literature. Eleanor Ostrom's literature on the commons, for example, is born out of a wood example, actually, in Turning in Switzerland. There's a 12th century irrigation system that was essentially managed locally with no plan and survived for centuries, and showed how people can actually manage water locally. And what's interesting about the story of water is that, particularly in the 20th century, is that the story of water in the 20th century is this kind of tension between the problem of local communities' right to self-determination and individual rights to property and other sort of basic attributes of a modern democratic society on the one hand, and then the requirements of the underwriting capacity of a federal government, of a large government, to build a kind of infrastructure that delivers the kind of security that we've all become accustomed to. So California, when John Wesley Powell was visiting and sort of looking around saying, oh, nobody lives here. And of course he was wrong, right? But the kind of people that he had in mind that should live there, in his mind, would not have been able to live there. Europeans would not have been able to move west had the landscape not be completely transformed. And indeed, that's what happened. And it happened on the back of the underwriting capacity of a large state. Now, the trade-off there was political representation in exchange for all those investments, and that's how you end up with this very peculiar situation in America, where you have underpopulated states with with great political weight, right? Because it costs money to occupy sovereign territory, and the investment that you make comes with political leverage and political power. It's a tension, and it can break, and it can work really badly, right? And so when you are far away And the only lever that you have is, remote politics and money sent over the Pacific. It can get quite difficult. And so I think that the question for places like Hawaii is tying the management of the landscape and the management of water, which is the principal instrument of the management of landscape, to a political project, to a vision that's tied to a political project and a kind of a vision for the community, right? For the chives, for the polity that then exercises its right within the federal system. That's why, again, I come back to this point, which is it's so important that this doesn't become an engineering question, because if it's an engineering question, you assume the answer is given. Everybody needs to look like Los Angeles. You've tied yourself to a system that requires the kind of underwriting that requires a sovereign treasury, and then very quickly you are into this game of being beholden to central government. That may be fine, but it has to be the result of a collective choice, not the result of an imposition.
Thank you. Someone actually couldn't access the Q&A and chatted me a question I think is of interest to everyone here. So you're speaking to a community interested in applied and interdisciplinary collaborations. You mentioned directly and indirectly the importance of interdisciplinary applications to this issue. So what advice do you have for us about the kinds of organizing, collaboration, the ways of being that we should be thinking about in order to become more interdisciplinary?
I think that you have to put the human being at the heart of what you do. I started life as a pretty hardcore mathematician and scientist, and maybe it's the atrophy of my frontal cortex, or maybe it's just age, but I'm getting more and more interested in the arts as a mechanism to express, individual needs. And, Anna Arendt had this point in The Human Condition, and she used to say that it's her problem at the time was a different problem, but it has interesting analogies. Talking about the 50s, the scientists were the philosopher kings of the age. The nuclear scientists held the keys to the power of the cosmos. And because everything was expressed in language of engineering and science, it was inaccessible to voters and people. And so it extracted the problem of governing the nuclear age from the zoon politikon, from the political animal, right? It's really important that on existential issues, and I would argue water is an existential issue, particularly in the case of climate change, that people are given the language to author their life. They're given the language to express their needs and to debate politically what they need. And that does not and cannot require an engineering degree, and cannot and does not require a science degree. But we all have words, and we all understand images. And so to me, the journey to interdisciplinary starts with story. It doesn't mean that science doesn't play a role, because you can generate stories out of science, but the glue that holds interdisciplinarity together, I think, is language and the stories. That's why I ended up writing a book, but I also worked on documentary making. But I think it's this question of how do you involve people in this conversation? And it's not beating them over the head with facts that they have to believe because you have a white coat and a PhD. That's not the route to change. The route to change is political. There's no way around it. Thankfully, we live in democracies, and therefore we have an obligation to participate. And to me, that's actually the way into interdisciplinarity.
Thank you. Yeah, and to add on Gordon's question, applying that for students, how would you, especially if they're already in their in college, how do they do that there?
Well, I think one other thing is, I learned it, confronting real water problems in the real world and talking to people who have to confront real water problems in the real world at all levels of decision makings is a great exercise in humility, because you end up realizing that, it's a world of second best options and imperfect choices. And that's an important thing to realize if you want to be a change maker, because if indeed you believe my thesis, which is that these are fundamentally political stories, that it's about the res publica, and therefore the negotiations between different interests in the service of collective good, not the victory of one ideology over another, then you have to be open to discussion and to hearing other people. And on these issues of water, funnily enough, what you see depends on where you're standing. And so, you know, I think if you want to be a change maker as a water student, become a competent scientist, of course, become a competent engineer, but then go visit your local utility and figure out, you know, ask the question, what are the problems they're actually facing? Not just technical problems, but what do people tell them? How are they treated? How do they interface with political decision makers? What do politicians don't understand? You know, it's, I think it's a really interesting exercise. And also ask yourself, go on the other side, right? I mean, if you're studying water engineering, visit farms, find out what the farmer is looking for, find out what the, you know, the energy producer is looking for. Because however, you know, I've had this experience for 15 years. I used to talk to ministries of water, and you know, you'd always have this impression that they thought, oh, if only the Ministry of Agriculture got it together, you know, then we'd know how to solve the problem. And then you go to the Ministry of Agriculture, and they're like, if only these other people. So I think conversation and trying to understand the multiple points of view, you know, the story of water is sort of like a river. You have riparian issues all over the place. People see the thing in different ways from different places. And it's really important to kind of wrestle with reality and get your, you know, get dirt under your fingernails, as a friend of mine used to say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a question someone sent me that I think may tie to this, talking about the stories that we're telling about water. She said, I recently read an article that the heavily used narrative of water wars is both false and damaging, in that political conflicts are very multidimensional, and rarely, if ever, is water the primary driver. And the more we give credence to the water as a driver of conflict language, the more it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So she asks, what are your thoughts on this potentially controversial idea, and how can that perspective be balanced with the underlying fact that fresh water in particular is a limited resource within a world of an ever-growing population?
Yeah. Well, no, she's right. It's exactly right. I mean, water, provided you have states who have the capacity to negotiate, water leads to coordination and cooperation overwhelmingly, rather than war. The classic example of this is the relationship between Pakistan and India along the Indus, which I write at length about in the book. These countries have gone to war 3 times. They're both nuclear powers, and yet they've managed so far to operate under the provisions of a bilateral treaty, the Indus Waters Treaty, that was brokered by the World Bank in the 1960s and has essentially withstood ever since. Now, that's creaking. Kashmir turns out to have become an increasingly difficult flashpoint, but considering how important the Indus is to the survival of Pakistan and the broader landscape to the Indian future, it's actually remarkable that these 2 countries have been able to operate that way. And again, another example, you look along the Nile, many countries along the Nile, but there's this very fraught relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has built the Grand Renaissance Dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, to the chagrin of Egypt. They timed the building. They broke ground the day Mubarak fell. I was actually in Addis when this happened. It was kind of interesting. The day Mubarak fell, they broke ground on the dam on the Blue Nile. But even so, you know, there was always this story that Egypt would go to war if somebody had built a big piece of infrastructure on the Nile, threatening their water sources. But then, you know, so far they've been exchanging harsh words, but have not actually engaged in conflict. And the examples go on, right? I mean, water is an instrument of power, and war tends to be pretty unpredictable and rather destructive. And so countries in general tend not to engage in war over water. I should say, though, that that's not always the case. When I was in Ethiopia, I worked a fair amount on the southern border of Oromia with Kenya, where there are nomadic tribes that cross the border, and Borana tribes and other tribes, and they have cattle, and they congregate at watering holes. And sometimes when La Nina is particularly bad, that part of the country gets very dry, and there's few water resources, and war breaks out between these tribes, and people die. Right, these are tribes with AK-47s. They're not. This is not trivial. And part of the reason is that there are lots of reasons, right? I mean, they operate on a much smaller landscape because of the crazy reforms that the Derg regime and Haile Selassie before them implemented. So these are not nomadic tribes operating under the ideal conditions that they used to have. Nevertheless, war can break out over water when there aren't mechanisms to negotiate. That's why states are so important, I think, because political institutions, give you the means to negotiate over the states. Again, to give you another example that's very relevant, Ukraine right now, is a hotspot of the world. One of the issues was that, of course, Russia invaded Crimea a couple of years ago for a variety of reasons. Crimea is an agricultural landscape, except that it gets its water from the North Crimean Canal, which gets its water from the Dnipro River, where the famous Dniprostroi Dam is. And that river is in Ukrainian territory. In fact, it's in the territory that's now contested. So, water is never the cause of conflict, but it's an interesting participant and can complicate things significantly. Last example I will give you, because it was brought up earlier, Sally brought up the question of migrations. Often people make a case that Syrian migration happened because of the scarcity. Let's be clear, Assad is to blame for problems in Syria, but water again can be a profound stressor. So I agree with you. It's an important story. I don't know that it's that controversial, but it's certainly one that people should realize. The story of oil, water the new oil, just doesn't really reflect reality.
Thank you so much, Giulio. We are at time. That hour went by really quickly, and I see my colleague Ben has joined us to say hi as well.
Thank you, Giulio, and thank you to Gordon and Athena and the whole Future Rivers community for being with us today. Giulio, you never disappoint in any of our conversations as a colleague and a friend, and it's just fantastic for you to take the time with us today, and we wish you all the best.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will have the recording available early next week to share with your students and colleagues. Giulio, good luck with almost Hurricane Eunice over London.
Thank you. We'll survive.
Have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.